I never imagined the smell of rotten water would be the thing that nearly erased 3 generations of my family's work. And I sure as hell never imagined the man responsible would end up begging me for something he thought money could always buy. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 59 years old, and I run an 80-acre cattle ranch just outside Paso Robles, California. My grandfather bought this place back in the early 60s with money he scraped together after working construction for almost 15 years. My father expanded it one fence line at a time, and when he passed away, I promised him I'd never sell it, no matter how high the offers got. Around here, people always joke that ranchers never really own the land. We just borrow it from the next generation. That always stuck with me. Every fence post, every oak tree, every muddy trail carries a memory. My wife Claire used to say she could tell what season it was just by looking at the pond behind our south pasture. In spring, it reflected the wildflowers. In summer, the cattle crowded around it every afternoon, and in winter it became a mirror for those gray California skies. That pond wasn't just another body of water. It quotes a mine, 100 head of cattle alive through every dry season we'd ever had. Life stayed pretty predictable until the vineyard showed up next door. The property had been empty for years after the old almond orchard shut down. Then one day survey crews rolled in, followed by bulldozers, concrete trucks, architects, landscapers. Within months, the hillside looked more like Napa than ranch country. The owner was a guy named Adrian Holloway, young compared to me, maybe mid-40s, former tech executive from San Jose, who'd cashed out at exactly the right time. Folks in town couldn't stop talking about him. $8 million winery, luxury tasting room, wedding venue, imported French barrels, bottles that sold for more than some families spent on groceries in a week. At first, I figured we'd stay out of each other's way. He liked wine. I liked cattle. Plenty of room for both of us. The first time we met, he drove up in a spotless black Range Rover while I was fixing a busted gate. He stepped out wearing loafers that probably cost more than my truck tires and smiled like we were already friends. "You're Ethan, right? I hear you've been here forever." I laughed. "Long enough to know where all the rattlesnakes live." He smiled politely, but I could tell he didn't really get the joke. He spent most of the conversation talking about his vision. Luxury tourism, international recognition, investors flying in on private jets. I nodded because that's what neighbors do. Before leaving, he looked across my pasture and said something that bothered me more than I admitted at the time. "Beautiful land. Honestly, this whole valley could be worth 10 times more if it were vineyards instead of cattle." I smiled back, but inside something tightened. "Maybe," I said, "but my family didn't raise grapes." For a while, everything seemed fine. Construction noise came and went, more traffic than I liked, but nothing worth arguing over. Then June arrived, temperatures climbed, and little things started feeling wrong. The pond had always carried that earthy smell you'd expect from fresh water surrounded by grass and livestock. One morning I walked down to check a water pump and caught a sharp chemical odor that didn't belong there. I stood still for a second, thinking maybe somebody nearby had spilled fuel. The smell faded with the wind, so I shrugged it off. 2 days later, the water looked cloudy. Not muddy. Cloudy. There was a difference. Thin streaks floated across the surface like soap film. Claire noticed it too while helping me check mineral blocks. "That doesn't look right," she said quietly. I remember kneeling beside the bank, scooping up water in my hand, watching tiny brown bubbles collect between my fingers before popping. I told myself maybe it was algae, maybe heat, maybe runoff after irrigation. Ranchers learn not to panic over every strange thing nature throws at you. Looking back now, I wish I'd panicked sooner. The first cow died 3 mornings later. Healthy 6-year-old Angus. No warning. I found her lying on her side near the pond before sunrise. Our veterinarian, Dr. Melissa Grant, came out that afternoon. She examined the carcass, frowned more than she spoke, and finally said, "Let's keep watching the herd." That sentence haunted me, because by the end of the week we weren't watching one sick animal anymore. We were watching an entire disaster unfold right in front of us. By the end of that first week, I'd buried 4 cows. And every time I climbed into the tractor to dig another grave, I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation that wasn't as bad as the one slowly forming in the back of my mind. Ranchers don't scare easily. You spend enough years dealing with droughts, disease, wildfires, and market crashes. You learn to keep your emotions on a short leash. But watching healthy animals stagger across a pasture like they'd forgotten how to walk, that's something different. 2 more cows collapsed before Monday afternoon. They foamed at the mouth. Their legs buckled beneath them, and their breathing turned shallow within minutes. Claire stood beside me, holding on to the fence rail so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Ethan," she whispered, "something's poisoning them." I didn't answer because saying those words out loud somehow made them real. "Doctor." Melissa came back with extra equipment this time. She collected blood samples, tissue samples, and several gallons of pond water. She didn't joke around like she usually did. She simply loaded everything into coolers, looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Don't let the rest of the herd drink from this pond until I call you." That sentence alone cost me almost an entire day. I had to haul emergency water tanks from a neighboring ranch nearly 20 miles away, running back and forth until after dark. My neighbor, old Frank Dalton, watched me filling portable troughs and finally asked, "What's going on?" I shrugged. "I honestly don't know." He nodded slowly before saying something that would stick with me later. "Sometimes the answer's sitting right next door." 6 days passed before Melissa called. I knew the news wasn't good because she drove out instead of explaining it over the phone. She spread several laboratory reports across the hood of my truck while the afternoon wind tried carrying them away. "These aren't naturally occurring levels," she said quietly. "We're seeing industrial cleaning compounds, sulfites, acidic residue, enough to kill livestock." I stared at the papers without really reading them. "How does something like that end up in a cattle pond?" Melissa hesitated before answering. "It doesn't, unless someone put it there." I felt my stomach sink. She asked if anyone upstream shared the watershed. I told her there wasn't any upstream creek. The pond was fed mostly by groundwater and seasonal runoff. She looked toward the winery. "Then we keep looking." The next morning, Melissa returned with an environmental consultant she'd worked with before, a former state inspector named Owen Brooks. Owen was one of those guys who barely spoke while working. He carried fluorescent flags, a ground scanner, and enough measuring equipment to outfit a construction crew. We spent nearly 4 hours walking property lines before he suddenly stopped beside an old row of eucalyptus trees separating my pasture from Adrian's vineyard. He crouched down, brushed away loose dirt with one hand and frowned. "This ground settled recently." I knelt beside him. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then he uncovered the edge of black industrial piping buried just beneath the surface. My pulse started climbing. Owen followed the pipe another several hundred feet using his locator until it disappeared beneath the winery property. "Well," he finally muttered, "there's your answer." We requested county assistance that afternoon. By evening, inspectors confirmed the line carried wastewater directly from the winery's production facility. Fermentation residue, chemical cleaning solution, tank wash runoff. Everything flowed underground before emptying into my pond through a concealed discharge point hidden beneath thick reeds. I remember standing there staring at that outlet while filthy water trickled into the place where my cattle had been drinking for decades. I wasn't angry at first. I was numb. Anger came later, much later. My first call was to Adrian. He answered on the third ring, sounding almost annoyed. "Everything all right, Ethan?" I took one slow breath. "Your wastewater line empties into my pond." Then a chuckle. "That's impossible. County inspectors are standing here looking at it." Another pause. Then his tone hardened. "Your cows probably ate toxic weeds. Happens all the time. Don't insult me. Look, I have investors arriving in an hour. If you got some ranch problem, don't make it mine." Click, he hung up. I stood there holding the phone while Owen slowly shook his head. "Didn't even ask if the animals were all right," he muttered. That's when something inside me changed. Until then, I'd been trying to solve a problem. Now I understood I was dealing with someone who believed money erased consequences. The next several days became absolute chaos. 27 cattle were dead. More than 30 were receiving treatment. Emergency feed bills climbed by the hour because I couldn't safely use the south pasture anymore. Claire stayed strong in front of me, but I caught her crying once inside the equipment barn. She bottle-fed some of those calves years earlier. They weren't numbers to us. They were part of our daily lives. Meanwhile, social media filled with glamorous videos from Adrian's winery. Couples laughing with wine glasses. Sunset concerts. Gourmet dinners. Every smiling photo made my blood boil because less than 1,000 feet away, I was hauling dead livestock with the tractor. Then, almost by accident, fate handed me something Adrian never realized he'd revealed months earlier. I was reviewing old property surveys with my attorney, Hannah Pierce, searching for anything that might help during the inevitable lawsuit. We spread decades of easement maps across my dining room table. Hannah suddenly tapped one document. "What's this well?" I laughed. "That's our deep aquifer well. Grandpa drilled it back in 73. Best water source in his valley. She kept reading. Is anyone else connected? No. At least nobody should be. The sentence barely left my mouth before another memory hit me. Almost a year earlier, I'd noticed fresh tire tracks leading toward the well enclosure after construction crews started working next door. I assumed utility contractors had simply crossed the property by mistake. I never bothered checking because nothing seemed disturbed. My chest tightened. I grabbed the truck keys before Hannah could ask another question. 20 minutes later, we reached the locked pump station. The chain looked untouched. The padlock was still mine. But after opening the access gate, we both froze. A brand new high-capacity commercial pipeline had been spliced directly into my main distribution line. Professional installation, industrial fittings, shut-off valves, pressure regulators. Someone had borrowed my water. They'd built an entire hidden supply system. Hannah slowly looked up at me. Did you authorize any of this? Not a chance. We traced the pipe visually until it disappeared underground, heading straight toward the winery. Suddenly, every conversation I'd had with Adrian replayed differently inside my head. Every time he bragged about opening on schedule, every time he'd mentioned how difficult permitting had been, every casual smile. He'd never once asked permission because he already knew the answer would be no. He simply stole what he needed. Hannah quietly said the words I needed to hear. Ethan, that's your private well. Your water. Your infrastructure. If this connection is unauthorized, you're under no obligation to keep supplying him. I looked at the steel shut-off valve sitting less than 2 feet away. My grandfather installed the original assembly with his own hands over 50 years ago. I could still remember being 12 years old while Dad explained what every valve did. Never touch this unless you're protecting the ranch, he'd said. I rested my hand on the wheel. For a long moment, I didn't move. This wasn't revenge. Revenge would have been smashing equipment or cutting pipes. This was something much simpler. I was taking back something that had never belonged to Adrian in the first place. I turned the valve exactly 90 degrees until it stopped. The sound wasn't dramatic. No explosion. No alarms. Just the dull metallic thump of old steel settling into place. Hannah looked toward the distant winery buildings. Think he'll notice? I climbed back into the truck, started the engine, and finally allowed myself the smallest smile I'd worn in weeks. Give it until tomorrow morning. If you want to see how one legal turn of a valve brought an $8 million winery to its knees, the next morning I was halfway through repairing a section of fence when my phone buzzed. It was Frank. He didn't even bother saying hello. You ought to drive past that winery. I could hear the grin in his voice. Something tells me today's going to be interesting. I climbed into my old pickup and stayed on the county road instead of pulling onto Adrian's property. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. Delivery trucks were lined up outside the service entrance. Employees hurried back and forth carrying hoses and empty containers while a forklift sat abandoned in the middle of the loading area. Nobody looked relaxed anymore. Around noon, my phone rang. Adrian. I let it ring twice before answering. His confidence had disappeared overnight. Ethan, we've got a problem. I leaned back in my seat. Do you? Our water stopped. That's unfortunate. There must be something wrong with your well. I almost laughed. My cattle are drinking from it right now. Silence. Then he tried a different approach. Can we come look at the connection? What connection? Another long pause. He knew exactly what I meant. Look, we need to get production running. Funny, I replied. That's almost exactly what I said when my cow started dying. He hung up without another word. Over the next week, the winery unraveled faster than I honestly expected. Wine production isn't something you can simply pause. Fermentation tanks require constant monitoring. Cooling systems need water. Cleaning equipment needs water. Bottling wines need water. Even the expensive tasting room depended on functioning restrooms and kitchens. By the third day, they had canceled every scheduled tour. Visitors began posting online about strange smells drifting from the production buildings. Restaurant deliveries were delayed. Employees stood around waiting because they couldn't sanitize equipment. By the end of the first week, local rumors spread faster than wildfire. Some blamed mechanical failures. Others whispered about contamination. Nobody knew the truth except a handful of us. Then, county environmental officials made everything public. Their investigation confirmed the illegal wastewater discharge. Within hours, news crews appeared outside the winery gates. Drone footage showed inspectors collecting evidence while state vehicles filled the parking lot. Adrian suddenly wasn't the successful entrepreneur everyone admired. He became the businessman accused of poisoning a neighboring ranch. A few days later, he showed up at my gate in a pickup instead of his luxury SUV. No designer sunglasses. No expensive jacket. Just a tired man who looked like he hadn't slept in days. I met him beside the cattle guard without inviting him onto the property. He stared across the pasture for several seconds before speaking. "Can we fix this?" I folded my arms. "Depends what you mean by fix. Name your number." I shook my head. This stopped being only about money the day my animals started dying. He looked away, for the first time since we'd met. He didn't seem like the smartest man in every room. He simply looked exhausted. I handed him a folder Hannah had prepared. Inside were veterinary invoices, laboratory reports, cleanup estimates, property damage assessments, and a proposed legal agreement. He flipped through the pages in silence. Finally, he looked up. "You're asking for full compensation. Every dollar. And this monthly water lease? 30 years. That's excessive." I looked him straight in the eye. So was dumping industrial waste into my pond. He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. "And this?" he asked, pointing toward another page. "You build a certified wastewater treatment system before water service resumes. Independent inspections every year. One violation and the agreement terminates permanently." Adrian slowly rubbed his forehead. "You really thought this through?" "No," I answered quietly. "Your decisions forced me to." He stood there for nearly a minute without speaking. Finally, he signed every page. 2 hours later, the wire transfer cleared. Compensation for the cattle, medical expenses, environmental restoration, advance payment on the water lease. Every penny arrived exactly as agreed. Only then did I reopen the valve supplying his facility. But the financial settlement turned out to be the smallest part of Adrian's problems. State environmental regulators issued massive penalties after completing their investigation. His winery lost key certifications that had made his premium labels so valuable. Distribution partners quietly backed away. Investors who once lined up to celebrate his vision suddenly disappeared. The same business magazines that had praised his rapid success now published stories questioning his management. 18 months later, the property was sold to another ownership group at a fraction of what Adrian had invested. I haven't spoken to him since the day he drove away from my ranch after signing those papers. Sometimes I wonder whether he ever understood what really destroyed his winery. It wasn't me. It wasn't the fines. It wasn't even losing access to my well. It was the moment he convinced himself that because he had more money, he had the right to treat someone else's land, someone else's livelihood, and someone else's family as if they didn't matter. Today my pond is clear again. The new owners built a modern treatment system before producing a single bottle of wine. My herd has recovered, though every spring I still find myself counting cattle twice, almost out of habit. Claire says that's a scar that probably never goes away. Maybe she's right. Every month, the lease payment still arrives automatically. But honestly, that's never been the part that mattered most. What matters is walking down to that pond at sunrise, watching healthy cattle drink clean water, and knowing my grandfather's promise stayed intact. Around here, we still say we don't really own the land. We just protect it until the next generation takes over. Maybe that's why I never regretted turning that valve. So now I'm curious what you think. Did I do the right thing by cutting off the water immediately? Or should I have handled everything through the courts and waited while more damage piled up? Let me know down in the comments because stories like this always divide people, and I genuinely like to hear where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes action should always have consequences. There's another unbelievable true style story waiting for you right here.